You are listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I am your host, Celine Yeager. Each week, I bring you advice from athletes, scientists, researchers, and other experts to help you feel and perform your best, no matter what your hormones are doing. This show is a production of Live Feisty Media. Hello, strong, feisty women. I hope you all are well. And I am psyched to bring you a very spirited conversation that I had this week with Christine Yu, the author of Up to Speed, The Groundbreaking Science of Women Athletes. And spoiler alert, if you haven't read the book yet, I'm in it. Christine called me up when she was writing it because she was finding, as I did when I started this podcast, that so many of the women that she was interviewing were like, why didn't anybody tell me menopause was going to be like this? Why didn't I know there were all these symptoms? Why didn't I know that all of this could happen seemingly out of nowhere so quickly? You know, all the stuff that we talk about on this show for the past 3 years. So I shared my experiences with her, and she called up other women like Amanda Thebe, who's been on the show. She called up adventure athlete Rebecca Rush, and she shared her experiences. She shared Dr. Stacy Sims' insights, and she dug into what research she could find for active women in menopause. And as you might expect, she found it lacking. Because as we know, as active women, we are in a small minority in the big picture of very sedentary populations. And while medical science has not prioritized women in research in general, let alone menopausal active women in sport. So, yeah, we have traditionally gotten the very short end of the research stick. So, and this also led with Christine and I to a broader conversation about all the shit we have to watch out for as girls and women, especially during this time of life. Like being made to feel like you're other or less than simply because you're not male. How it's insane that girls still drop out of sports because of embarrassment about their boobs bouncing and periods, and how we always have this nagging voice in our heads questioning our capabilities because of the messages that we get that our bodies are somehow defective or deficient compared to men's. Again, especially around the menopause transition, where we're getting a lot of messages about being deficient and diseased and falling apart. It's it you absorb that, and it can do real damage. And we really do need to flip the script and to make our bodies the norm. Why don't we do that? Why don't we just make female bodies the norm? Because we are more than half the population, and we are whole. We are strong, capable, whole people just the way we are. And don't let menopausal diet culture, which we also take on during this episode, tell you any differently. Anyway, I really, really, really enjoyed this conversation with Christine and shining a light on all of these important issues that are so ubiquitous and so common that we can sometimes just accept them and absorb them, though we really, really shouldn't. And I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Okay, before we get into it, as always, you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Feisty Menopause. We have that private Hit Play Not Pause group. Continues to grow. I think we're working on about 28,000 women in there at this point. And keep your eyeballs peeled for a menopause course that we are working on as we speak. It's called Navigate Menopause. It is designed to help you cut through a lot of this noise and confusion and misinformation and chart your course, your personal course to your best life through and beyond this really important, meaningful transition in our lives. So keep an eyeball peeled for that. Okay, I want to make a note that this interview will be the last new show of 2023. That is almost impossible to believe, but here we are. Make sure you stay tuned after the conversation. I have some amazing guests lined up for 2024, and I'll give you a little sneak peek into what's to come in the new year at the bottom of the show. Finally, a very, very quick thanks to NutriSense for their continued ongoing support of the show. Wearing a CGM really did help me understand how my lifestyle, specifically stress, was for me as important, if not more important, for managing my blood sugar as what I ate. So thank you so much, NutriSense, for your support. Listeners can get $30 off any subscription to a CGM program with the code HITPLAY30. That's all caps, one word, and the number 30, HITPLAY30, at nutrisense.io/HITPLAY. That's in the show notes if you just want to click on it. Okay, enough of me. Let's have a few words about those awesome sponsors and get on with the show. All right, Christine, welcome. And as we were just talking about before I hit record, you have been hard at work promoting this. When did it come out? You are up to speed. I'll hold it up so people can see it.
It came out May 16th.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Like 4
So
months.
that it seems longer, right? Does it seem longer to you?
It feels like about 6 years at this
Yeah.
point. But
Oh,
yeah.
it seems longer. How long did you work on it?
So I think I started in earnest working on it, I want to say September 2020.
Oh,
And
okay.
then we manuscript was done, put to bed, went off into production May 2022.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so about a year and a half, almost 2 years.
Yeah, that's about right. That's about the
I was very
gestation
naive.
period for a book.
I was very naive going into this. I was like, oh, I mean, because when you write magazine articles that you're and stuff, your turnaround is so fast. I was
Yeah,
like, a year, 12 months, that's so much time. I can totally get this done. And I was like, nope,
and
real
it's
quick, figure
not.
it out.
It's not. I know they throw out these figures like, oh, well, I think that'll come out in October 2025, and you're like, what?
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
But it does. It takes a lot of time, and yeah, it's laborious, and you did a really lovely job. I mean, it's fun to read, which is a mission in of itself to make this kind of book fun to read. So
I appreciate hearing that, especially coming from you. So thank you.
yeah. What inspired you to do it?
So the the answer that I've been giving is in large, which is true. It's in large part because I've been, through conversations with different athletes, especially at the professional and elite level, as well as with sources. When I was reporting a lot of the articles I was working on, people kind of kept saying, oh, almost like a whisper, right? Like a side whisper, well, we actually don't know that much about
Mhm.
female athletes, or we actually don't know how this kind of really works in women. And I'd be like, what are you talking about? And then I had the opportunity to write a piece for Outside, really looking at kind of this research gap in sports science research, and got to talk to Stacy Sims a
Mhm.
lot more. And Stacy's like, well, let me tell you
Yeah.
what's going on. And so that kind of really got my wheels turning in terms of really trying to, or wanting to understand why this happens systemically. And not only that, but just really trying to understand the implications of it, right? What does
Mhm.
it then mean for girls and women in sport if we are understudying them? The kind of more honest answer is that my agent told me to write the book. She's like, I think this is a book. And I was like, I don't want to write a book. And she's like, but I think this is a book. I was
I
like,
have so much respect for that
I
answer.
don't know if I want to write a book. And so we talked a bit more. I was like, okay, you're right. This is actually the thing that I've been thinking a lot about over these last couple of years and have been really curious about. And if I were to spend 2+ years working on something, this would be the thing.
Yeah, and it does. It takes that amount. I respect that. It is a lot. Writing a book is so much different than writing, as an article or even 5 articles. Um and it's interesting because I asked when you started it because it feels 2020, and I don't mean
Mhm.
that, especially in the menopause
Yeah.
specifically. Like the rest of it doesn't. I wouldn't have been able to go 2020, but only because the conversation around menopause has changed so rapidly since we started talking about it. I started this podcast in 2020. The Next Level came out. I don't even know, was it this year? Last year? Oh my God,
Last
time is
year?
so
Yeah.
so crazy. I'd have to look it up. But from the
Yeah.
time like I started this podcast too, because literally nobody was talking about it. And as you mentioned in your book, in the chapter, The Change, like nobody's talking about it. And I'm wondering if you feel like I feel like that landscape has really changed in that short amount of time.
Yeah, it definitely does feel like it has changed. And that's one of That's one of the frustrating things, right, about writing a book like this
Book.
is because you do all the research, you put it to bed, and then it's still like another year before it comes out. And so things become outdated. And in the similar way with a lot of the studies I was looking at, I had to stop at some point, right?
Right.
To like stop looking for new studies because I couldn't incorporate that information or I'd drive myself crazy trying to do so.
Yeah.
But to your question, the landscape feels like it has changed phenomenally, right? That talking about menopause and acknowledging menopause is so much more in just, the cultural conversation in everyday conversations. I have so many more conversations about it with friends of mine. Um, in a way that definitely we weren't talking about it before. I mean, it's in part because, obviously I've aged and, I feel like very firmly in this like perimenopause phase right now, along with my friends
Hmm.
and other folks, but it definitely feels like it has blown up in a way that, yeah, when I was starting to write the book, it didn't feel that same.
Yeah. Yeah. That's been my experience too, which is great. And it's also a little disorienting because uh I hope that the research catches up, and we'll talk about this,
Yeah.
like the holes in the research and um where the scientific study needs more attention because we are now a ginormous market, which
Hmm.
means, people are just jumping in to fill those gaps who may or may not have good intentions, may or may not have good
Yep.
information, like, and it's really, really difficult when you have the internet
Yeah.
to discern that.
Well, absolutely, and I'm sure your inbox is the same as mine, right? The number of PR pitches that you get for like these new menopause related products and supplements and like God knows what other type of tracking device or like whatever is out there. Um, and it's definitely on the one hand, I'm really happy and excited that people are acknowledging this, that we are starting to pay attention and put resources into this because it's been so neglected for so long. But to your point too, right? That because there is such a hunger for this information and so many of us, right, are suffering and just trying to figure it out, like we do want the product, the plan, the supplement, the food, whatever it is to just help us feel better. And I do worry about that a lot too in terms of, how can we kind of continue to push this and like keep menopause at the forefront, but not in this like almost predatory kind of way, right? That you're taking advantage of folks because we are in this, I don't want to say vulnerable, but kind of, right? Like we're in this state where we are really just hungry for something.
Yeah, I agree, and I use that term a lot. I use the term predatory a lot because it feels very
Yeah.
predatory, especially when they zone in. I mean, it may the thing that makes me most sad, Christine, is that I feel like the worst parts of the beauty industry
Mm-hmm.
magazines have found and followed us and are honing in on us,
Yep.
right? Like you had all of those magazines back in the 90s and early aughts, talking about muffin tops and saddlebag, like all the terrible things that they talked about women's bodies that they were insecure about. And now we're talking menopause and they, like it just like zoning in on anything that makes you feel bad about yourself and just and it I I hate it. I mean, there's
Yeah.
no other way to say it. I just
Yeah.
hate it.
I was actually just thinking about this morning, how it feels very diet culture right? It feels
Yes.
very much like those women's fitness magazines. And like in a way, like I get why it makes sense or like why that tactic kind of works because that's what we grew up with, right?
Yep.
Like
Yep.
as like Gen X and like, growing up in this diet culture, growing up like always like thinking about our bodies in a specific way or not having just the freedom to be just ourselves and in our bodies and live as it is. But
Hmm.
like, I get why then we get to menopause and everything feels really uncertain again. Like it is, right? Like it's like adolescence in it again, because our
Yeah.
bodies are transforming so much. And so I get why like those tactics work, especially with this population, right?
Yeah, we've been primed for it. We've
Yeah.
been yeah, our whole lives. Yeah,
Yeah.
and here we are. Yeah, I literally just wrote a blog that'll come out next week because I'm so frustrated with it. But it is what it is. You have to take the good attention with the bad,
Yeah.
I guess, and just try to filter your feeds appropriately. This is the only advice I have. One of the things, speaking of misinformation that I really wanted to talk about early on in this conversation, because I kind of really scratch my head at it, is that there's this arm of misinformation on the internet that is calling menopause new.
Mhm.
Like they're like, "Oh, we're new because women didn't live that long before." And I'm like, you don't you know how average life expectancy works, right? It doesn't mean everybody dropped dead at 48. It
Yeah.
just like um and in your book you found, references to menopause articles. I love the name of the on the end of menstruation is the time for the beginning of various diseases,
Yeah.
from like 1710. Um I'm wondering, like, when you went historically, when you looked back, like,
Mhm.
what did you think you would find? What stood out to you as you explored the history of menopause through a medical lens?
Yeah. That's a great question, and I think I thought I would find kind of that similar, sentiment and bias against women's bodies that we've
Mm,
seen so much when it comes to just sports and athletics in general, right? Like that that, the body is so frail, your uterus is going to fall out. Like, God, don't mess up your menstrual cycle, or,
yeah,
all these things around fertility. And it makes sense, right? That
yeah,
because fertility has played such a central role, that the kind of commentary and criticism would focus more specifically on those factors and issues. So that's what I kind of assumed. And so, when things like that article, right, when we're talking about menopause and its connection to disease and you're like dying and all of this stuff, like that wasn't super surprising to me.
yeah.
I guess what was surprising, I mean, surprising and also not, is just the way that it was just assumed and accepted that like this is a thing that happens, but then there was no kind of further inquiry into it, right? That there was just like, that's the sucks to be you kind of thing. And that um we just accepted it as a fact that this idea that menopause is adjacent to death, right? It's like kind of that next step before death. Whereas there's so many there's potentially so many years, right, in between those phases, but that we just accepted that and we didn't even like thought that it was interesting or necessary to try to investigate more how we could help women who were obviously suffering from these symptoms, right? That these symptoms matter, or that the only kind of treatment that was worthy was something that would bring estrogen back, right? That would kind of bring back their fertility, their youthfulness.
Right.
So that's the piece of it that I was really interested. This idea that we want to kind of like freeze frame women in this like fertile stage, and that we don't allow just for the natural, like normal progression of our bodies.
Yeah, and there's so many echoes to what I'm seeing now to some of that conversation,
Yeah.
and we've been here before with the feminine forever
Mm,
conversation, and from the 60s, and it feels very Western
mm,
centered to me, like we look at everything sort of through a disease lens and
yep.
through a medication lens, and it's not acknowledging that there are women, literally millions around the globe, who do pretty well. They live long lives
Yeah.
and they're not medicalized. And why aren't we looking harder at that?
Yeah. And like, why is that not the norm, right? Why do
Right.
we have to make it such that it is something like this disease that we have to figure out and like cure in a way, right? I don't know what made me think of this, but like when you were talking about, it feels very westernized. All I can think of, I don't know if you are familiar with this cartoon of Asian women, kind of like the Asian women aging time,
Mhm.
over different time frames. And it's like they all, for young Asian women and kind of their mothers, they're in their 40s, they all look the same. They're really young, right? Like kind of that myth. And then all of a sudden you turn into this like old Asian woman with like the perm and like the glasses and the droopy cheeks and stuff like that. And I'm like, that's kind of how it feels in a way, right? Like that, but we don't like where is that middle ground that we're kind of missing? And why does that have to be invisible? Like, why can't that actually be brought more to the forefront?
Yeah, and I mean I think the answer is men. I mean, and I don't mean that, I don't wanna be like, "Oh, it's always the patriarchy." But, I mean,
It
like,
kinda,
men yeah, but yeah, I mean, men have been they dominated medical circles, right, for
yeah,
so long, and the only interest seemingly that the medical system had in women was the uterus,
yeah,
their ability, and that was it. I mean, the uterus wandered around and it like caused all kinds of problems, and like, but we that was it. It's just so crazy to me. And the only way it changes, and I think why we're seeing the conversation actually move at this point at this speed, is that you have a massive generation of women who
yeah,
came into the workforce in the 70s and through Title IX being active, bringing it to the active piece. And now they're all of age and platform where they have microphones and they're in charge of things, and there's no putting that genie back in the bottle. Like now that's what it takes.
yeah. I think that's a huge piece of it, right? Is like we see this huge shift in kind of the demographics of folks are in power, who have the decision making ability, who have money, frankly,
Yep.
right? Like, to focus on this and to say like, no, 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 we're actually gonna look at this and we're actually gonna try to figure this out.
Yeah, 100%. And it took I'm very glad to see it happening, and I'm glad to see those large voices speaking. I do, and I've mentioned this before, and I hate feeling like I'm throwing Oprah Winfrey under the bus every time I mention it, but it does bother me that, like now that she is, I don't know how old, she's in her 60s, and she is now very menopause forward. I wish she had talked about those heart palpitations and feeling like she was
Mm,
dying when she was, like, way younger, 15 years ago or so,
yeah,
then,
yeah,
and just, like, use that. I'm happy to see more women like her using that platform and
yep,
talking. Um, it feels a little like, oh, a little bandwagging,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
jumping
yeah.
now, and that's fine, whatever it takes to get this conversation and this research going, but, uh, yeah, well, I mean, we're here, and the more women that use their platforms like her, the better, but I
Yeah,
do wish that that would
yeah,
happen.
because you can imagine how much of an
But,
impact that would have had,
yeah,
right?
we'd be so much further down the road.
Yeah.
I mean, it's,
I mean,
speaking
it's
in
Oprah.
terms exactly, exactly. So, speaking of this, and I don't expect you, to be clear, Christine, to give me an epidemiological answer to all of my questions here, but one of the things, speaking of hormone therapy and sort of like, now we're in this place where there are a lot of people very, almost like they'd put it in the water, I think some people, if they could, right?
Yeah,
Like, without it, you are deficient, you are in a disease state if you don't have hormone therapy. There's a large drum beating that way, and I know we have been here before, and we, even though we don't yet have the evidence that it will protect all of these diseases that it's
mhm,
being, promoted to protect. A lot of people are just saying that sort of fast and loose. So one of the things that I've been really curious about as I think about it is that what did women's health look like from the mid to late 70s until the early 90s? Because as you note in the book, estrogen was the fifth most prescribed medicine in the US in 1975. And the Women's Health Initiative, the big study that got stopped early, that caused all the hormone therapy to cease, they closed the recruitment in 1998. So that's a lot of time where you had a
yeah.
lot of women on estrogen and other hormone therapies. Do we have a picture of what those cardiovascular rates looked like? Do we know that? Did they go up after millions of women literally stopped using hormones overnight when they stopped the Women's Health
Yeah,
Initiative?
yeah. It's a fantastic question, and I hadn't thought about that before because you're right, like, this is a huge population that we're talking about here, and would make an amazing study, right? But as far as I know, um, I don't know if we have any information about what's gone on with that population of women who were on therapy and then came off. I think that, I mean, my guess is that I doubt it, right? Like I
Yeah.
doubt that they were seen as were, no one would have thought to kind of track and keep tabs on that population of folks, um kind of as they moved on. And as you know, right, like we need that kind of longer term data to really understand what's going on. But yeah, I don't know, I mean, I would be so curious to find out. But what also blows my mind, right, is that estrogen being the fifth most prescribed medication, and then all of a sudden it's taken off the market. Like, and folks not really even thinking about, it's like, okay, what could be put in place of that, right? Like, you know what I
Nothing.
mean?
The
It's
women will
like
just suffer. Yeah.
just taking like Advil off the market or something like that, and be like, or that's a bad example, but but taking something else that is so like kind of essential or critical or whatnot, that doesn't really have an alternative. You're just taking it off the market and be like,
Well, it's not, I don't know if it is such a bad, for, like, for women who need it, it is, it's a lifeboat, right? Like,
yeah,
there are women who have very severe symptoms, and we know that that should be addressed. Full
yeah,
stop.
yeah,
I mean, especially now that we know that there are connections to severe symptomology and
yeah,
chronic disease. Like, those
yeah.
things, we need to address that, like, so it's not that off of a, of a comparison. And yeah, it's a very good observation. Like, okay, sorry, ladies, and then just nothing
And
for
then just
20 years.
nothing. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And no more study.
And no
I
more
mean,
study.
I think because, that was their moonshot and it was a lot of money.
Hmm.
And, then everybody's like, well, we're not going to put any money in that anymore because that
Yeah,
makes sense.
yeah,
It's kind of crazy. And it's really put us in this position where we have nothing. I mean, we have this giant gap, and they're trying to go back to the Women's Health Initiative and parse out things,
mm,
and try to tell, but hormone therapy itself has changed.
yep,
And you talk about that, um, it's treated in the research as a monolith. You
yep,
hear HRT, MHT, it's like, and when you in your book you talk about methodology and the importance of it and the problem with noise in research, and that's actually why women didn't get studied for a long time, because we were quote unquote noisy because we had all these hormone fluctuations. But I personally think there's little more research that's noisy than all the research I'm seeing on hormone therapy, because
yeah,
it just sort of lumps it in, and there's so many different forms and formulations and combinations that we know all have, like, slightly, if not greatly different impacts.
yeah. No, absolutely. And feel like you come across the same problem too, right? When we're talking about like hormonal contraceptives as well. There's so
Mm,
many different formulations. It's changed so much too since a lot of the early studies that were done. And I think that that's something that really that isn't acknowledged enough. Personally, I think in a lot of
yeah.
these studies, because like you said, like we do just kind of all lump it together. I I'm not sure, and so I don't want to say, right, but I'm not sure how detailed folks are kind of parsing out the different formulations that people are using, whether it is hormonal therapy or contraceptives, right? Like if they're actually going to that detail to really understand what's going on there and how those different profiles affect the participants in their larger study. Because again, that makes it harder to study. It makes it harder to come up with a finding, an average response, right? Because that's what all these studies are generally kind of concerned about, is like you want to find what the average response is. But I think it does such a disservice, and it simplifies things almost too much,
Yeah.
right? In the same way that I feel like a lot of the menstrual cycle stuff simplifies things too much. And it doesn't kind of communicate the fact that hormonal profiles, whether it is something that you're taking externally or if it's your own internal hormones, those profiles fluctuate so much between individuals, even within yourself, right? They can change over a course of month to month, obviously over the course of a lifespan, but we don't recognize that much. So we keep looking for, I think, like these one single answers that's going to fit everyone, which I don't know. I feel like that's part of where we get stuck, and why it feels like sometimes like there is no options for folks, because like, you know, there isn't enough choice in what those treatment options are to actually, really help someone with their
Yeah.
symptoms. Like I just had lunch with a good friend of mine who is, postmenopause and has had a really hard time of it, right? Like, and she's been on hormone therapy, been off of it, been back on, has read all of your and Stacy's books and like you guys been like trying all these things, but it's stopped working. And it feels really frustrating, like hitting this wall and being like, I don't know what else there is out there, right? Like I don't know what else to do at this point. And that makes me really angry, right? That we are in this position where we feel like we have no options.
Yeah, and it takes, and I'm sorry to hear that because and I'm sure she is not unique in that
Yeah.
situation. I mean that we're in a place and it takes a lot of work on oneself, right? Like so we're in a
Yeah.
place where you can like there are certain known entities within research about what
Yeah.
estrogen does, what progesterone does. You can sort of take that basic biological research and then you can go on to some other research on like what strength training does to satellite cells. You can
Yeah. Yeah.
take
Yeah. Yeah.
all of the research and then like what Stacy and I try to do is sort of pair that best together as we can so like at least women understand the basics of sort of
Yeah.
like this is what all this stuff does. And if you're feeling X, Y, and Z, here's what might help. But as to your point, there is like you need to track for yourself and you need
Yeah.
to trial and error. And there will always be outliers, and there
Oh,
always,
yeah.
and if only we all had like a personal person who could like help us. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
even then, like it's
It's hit or
we're not
miss too.
we're not test tubes. People
Yeah.
are not test tubes. We are you can't just put X and Y into the test tube and always get Z. Like it
Yeah.
just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. But I do think like that piece of it, that like the individuality and the nuance and like the different formulation, like all of that is something that, um, yeah, I'm just not sure most people are really thinking about, or not necessarily on the science level, scientific or scientist level, but kind of general public wise, right? We're not necessarily thinking about that or attuned to all of those different nuances. But I do think that that's something that, the researchers really do need to kind of parse out a little bit more, figure out how to handle.
Yeah. Yeah, and especially I think and they know it. I mean,
Yeah.
you have like I had Dr. Stephanie Falbian on the show this week and she beats that drum particularly a lot. Like we cannot just keep talking about hormone therapy as a one thing. Like it needs to
Yeah.
be we need to do research on like the different types and the formulations because they have different effects and that's really hard to do. That
Yeah.
research is really hard to do and it's going to take time and in the meantime we're going to have all the people on the internet as we just said in the beginning of the conversation, selling their solutions because there's all these holes and I think that if there's anything I want people to get out of this conversation, it's just understanding that, just understanding that there aren't not nobody does have all the answers and there's a reason for that. Like the
Yeah.
research is light years behind and it's very hard to do.
And it takes time, right? Like it
Yeah.
also takes time to not only do the studies, but then to build up that research base and evidence base.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really hard.
So speaking of research, like in your book specifically, I mean, it like my podcast and the work I do, it's really geared towards active women, which is a whole issue in and of itself because most people aren't active, right? Like the
Yeah.
vast majority of the population does not exercise on purpose,
Yeah.
let alone meet any, or let alone line up for a marathon. So when you're talking about an active to an athletic population, the research falls off a cliff. There's so much less.
Hmm.
And then when you want to talk about women, menopausal women, like I mean, you just keep going smaller and smaller. I'm wondering, like, given what I just said and the fact that the landscape is very Swiss cheesy in its holes, where do you think the biggest gaps are for when you're talking specifically about performance in a peri and postmenopausal population?
That's also a really great question. And I think, and this might be just my bias in understanding some of this stuff, but for me, it is really understanding what the effect, like we know, I feel like we know pretty decently, right? Like on one end of the life spectrum in terms of like the effect of like estrogen and progesterone coming into the system and what
Yeah.
happens there. Like it's that piece that I want to know more about. It's like as these hormones exit or kind of decline and decrease, or the ratios like come out of whack, right? Like does how does that then impact things like, we talk a lot about REDS, right? Relative energy deficiency in sport. Like, how does
Mhm.
that then impact those other systems and then our ability to train and adapt to that?
Mhm.
Right. So like you were saying, like we do know some stuff around, how it affects like satellite cells and, obviously kind of bone stuff
Right.
and all of this stuff. But I guess for me, like that bigger picture of what's that macro level environment, what is the changes in that larger macro level environment that does then impact our ability to train overall and to adapt to training. um, because again, like I can look at something like, yeah, okay, great, that does something to my satellite cells, but what does that mean, right? Like I
Right.
guess for me it's like it is that bigger picture of how does this all kind of come together so that we have a better sense of um how to attack, not, I don't want to say attack, but how do we address this, right? Like how can we then go about some of these things? So like that's a piece of it for me. The piece that we were just talking about, like hormonal therapy, is also a big piece, and really trying to understand like what's then the interplay between, bringing in this, external hormones into the system. Is that kind of this, does that play like the same or similar effect, really, as our endogenous estrogen and all of that? How does that compare to something like hormonal contraceptives as well, right? Like
Right.
kind of where, how does what does that spectrum look like? um yeah, I think like those are kind of big questions for me, and just trying to
And
understand that. And does that then mean, if I think like on a very simplistic level, people might think like, okay, your hormones are decreasing. Does that then mean your your physiology and anatomy, you're acting more like a male body, right? Like, which I think is again simplifying things way too much, but really just trying to understand what some of those nuances are.
yeah, and I've started to see research bubble up in that effect, which is nice to see.
Yeah.
It is good to see. It's interesting, sort of dovetailing the kind of two conversations we've been having is about like the monolith of hormone therapy and some of these holes. Like I will see women in the group, say that they're on hormone therapy and like their training is amazing and all this, and then I just find out that all they're taking is testosterone, and I don't mean, which is fine. I'm not
Yeah, yeah,
trying
yeah,
to,
yeah, yeah,
but I'm
yeah.
just like, well, there's a reason it's a banned substance and like, in tested competition because it does have an ergogenic effect, and that's not necessarily the same as what hormone therapy as a whole,
Yeah,
with
yeah.
ovarian hormones would have. So it's I have no point there other than, yes, we do need
No.
to sort of tease that all out a bit more.
Well, I think like the other, just thinking about it a little bit more, I think the other piece of it too, also what we've been talking about is understanding that the scientific research and really understand like building up this evidence base is going to take a really long time, right?
Yeah.
That we're probably years off from, and who knows if we'd ever get to some sort of consensus based guidelines or anything like that. But in that interim, what I'd also like to see is more like practical research in terms of like what can we do now, right? Like
Yeah. Oh, totally.
what are some, you know, interventions, like whether it's exercise or nutrition or, what have you, like what are some interventions that are proven to help now, right? As we wait for this other research to come down the line. And I know that there are some folks out there that are doing, some work around that, but that's what I want to see more of, because we can't keep, I mean, I guess we'd be forced to keep waiting, right? But like I feel like we deserve to have some more options and answers at this point.
Oh, yeah. And that's sort of what I was saying before. I don't expect people to just not do anything either.
Yeah.
That obviously that's why Stacey and I write the books that we do, and that's why I do the work I do. I mean, like we take our
Yeah.
best shots with what we
Yeah.
have and adjust accordingly. And a lot of times it works pretty well. But it's a I think the thing that is, when you're talking about what happens with performance and adaptations as the hormones walk out the door. What makes that tricky in my mind, Christine, is that there are these big dominoes that,
Yeah.
like sleep, right? If your sleep is disrupted by those hormones walking out the door, even if those hormones walking out the door won't necessarily mess up your training adaptations per se, let's just
Yeah.
separate those things, the sleep will.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's really hard. It's hard to just tease out like what is causing what at some point because the disruptions disrupt things that disrupt things,
Yeah.
so it becomes and I always tell people like try to hit the big ones,
Yeah.
and see if that helps because if you sleep better, you're going to have better adaptations irregardless of
Yeah.
what is happening.
Oh, 1,000%, right? Like that's such a big factor and kind of,
Yeah.
elephant in the room for sure.
Yeah, there's a few elephants. I mean, I think that's part of the problem, but yeah, it does take just sitting down and looking at like what is the big thing that's being disrupted. And sometimes I try to approach it that way when people are because it can be very overwhelming. You're like, I don't even know where to start. I'm like, well, what are the big things and
Yeah.
start there.
Yeah. And it's amazing, right? How just taking care of some of that stuff can help so
Yeah,
much.
100%. Did you ever wonder when you were writing your book what the research landscape might look like if women were the default instead of the afterthought? Or worse, noisy data to be avoided at all costs.
The special case. You're a special case.
Yeah.
Um, Oftentimes, right? Because I think that one of the things that I hope the book kind of illustrates too is really kind of the systemic level and the infrastructure level ways in which we kind of prop up all of this bias, right? Um, and that really comes from how these systems were set up in the first place that created all of these blind spots, that created just the way that we do things is the way that we do things. So we don't even question. Um, but I have thought a lot about that because if I, I mean, so many things I feel like would be much better if women were in charge. But I feel like I almost, maybe it is naive of me too to think of it this way, but I almost feel like if women were kind of the default from the beginning, um, we the the amount of research and just information that we'd have about the body, I feel like it would be so much richer. But I also feel like, we would also be in the position where um, we'd be open to and willing to study male bodies as well, right? That it wouldn't just be this exclusionary thing of like, we just need to study women and that's it. And that's all we need to understand. But I do think because women's bodies are so complicated and like have so many different factors happening that it creates, it almost expands our like knowledge base of what human beings are and can be in a way that I'm not sure that we get as much out of when we're just studying men's bodies, if that makes sense. But I do think that, like, I don't know, I feel like we would have greater perspective. We would be open to willing and studying like men as much as we're studying women, that there wouldn't be this kind of exclusionary feeling. And again, like I said, like maybe that's just my own kind of, naivete and like hopefulness. But yeah, I feel like it would be really different.
It would be very different. I wonder if it would be like I mean, it's such a thought experiment, but I wonder if it would be like because we are always framed as and I have been guilty of doing this myself, and I try to check myself when I do. We're always, like, comparing ourselves to the male ideal
Yeah.
almost, right? Bigger, faster,
Yeah.
stronger. As opposed to, like we'd be like, "Wow," as opposed to women who can go forever, men have these big fiber 2 muscles that just
Yeah.
burn out right away, and
Yeah.
they don't recover quite as quickly, like, that's
Yeah.
how, we're always framing ourselves as, like, we're not as, as men, but like you could flip that in many places
Yeah.
and be like where we are advantageous and men aren't.
Yeah.
I mean, if
Yeah.
it like if you were going to just completely flip the script instead of in the lovely way you said, like level the playing field and just understand us equally on
But
our
I
own
also
merits.
but I also think that, I mean, it does, I feel like it would also just change like it's more than self-confidence and belief in yourself, but I feel like it's just kind of this idea that women have constantly had to make like come up with not excuses, but like
No, sure.
explain themselves, right? Or to question themselves in their experience, or to kind of dismiss their experience because it doesn't match up to men's, right? So even thinking of things like, girls dropping out of sport because of their breasts and like breast pain, breast movement, not having sports bras, feeling embarrassed about it. But like, what if we lived in a world where it wasn't embarrassing? Like your boobs just move because your boobs move, right? Like that it just is the way it is. Or like you have your period and it like because like that is just the way it is and it's not something to be embarrassed about or to feel badly about. Or it's like we constantly, or at least I feel like I constantly question my body and the validity of my body and my experience, or my ability to do something, or um, the fact that I have a bajillion knee injuries because of my, terrible, like
Right.
like defective body and stuff like that. I wonder if we didn't have all of that hanging over our heads, how that would just transform like our ability just to be in the world in a way that we can be our full selves.
I agree 100% with that. I mean, that all of that. And it would be it would be so different. And I think about that when like when you're talking about we just get periods and how much shame is felt around like, oh my God, leaking. Like, my God, what
Yeah.
if you have blood on your pants? And I think like if men had periods and it was the like, say it's like we're watching Monday Night Football and some guy's gushing blood all over his pants, the people would be like, "That man is a warrior." Can you imagine how much blood he just lost and what the cramps must be like? I mean,
Yeah.
100% that's how it would
Yeah.
be framed, you
He's
know?
before he's
Uh,
out there like kicking ass and he's caught his period.
right, like, that guy, well, they don't make him tough.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
should really I just yes, we should be framing it the same way. And it's instead of this and I think we're getting there, but it's been a long time coming to
Yeah.
not feel this shame around just being a female in this world.
Yeah, it's so hard, right? And then like I have nieces who are growing up, right, in this world and like watching them try to navigate it. And in a lot of respects, I feel like they're light years ahead of where I was
Yeah.
at their age.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, too, like this stuff is still so pervasive in terms of like being embarrassed about their bodies and periods and all of this. And I feel like I don't know if we can if there's some more work that we can do just to normalize a lot of this stuff. And I feel like it does start a lot with like just plain education at a younger age, right? And just kind of understanding your body outside of just you get your cycles, how your fertility is controlled. Like it would just be so helpful.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I really appreciate, the work you do and shining the lid in these things and just talking about them and thinking about them through these lenses. It makes people think and realize where our knowledge still needs to grow, and I think that in itself is a great service. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would just sort of like to leave the audience with as far as getting up to speed, so to speak?
No, I mean, we covered so much. The only thing that I would say is, it's like it's also a lot of credit to the work that you and Stacey are doing or have done, right? In kind of pioneering this field and s- really being one of the first people out there talking about all of this stuff and why it's important. And I definitely couldn't be where I am or,
Yes.
have written the book without the work that you guys have done. So I do want to just say acknowledge that and say thank you too.
No, that's very nice. It's a mutual admiration society here. So, thanks so much. Well, that is our show. We will be taking a 2-week podcast break over the holidays, where you'll find a couple of our most popular episodes rebroadcast for your listening enjoyment. When we come back, man, oh man, do we have some great shows lined up for you. First out of the gate, I will have a show with Dr. Jody Duche, completely devoted to weight loss drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy for menopausal women. These drugs come up so much in our groups and in the mainstream media, and I just wanted to really cut through the noise and bring you the wisdom from a woman who has been studying these drugs for literally more than a decade. I have a study of hers from 2012. She is also an Ironman triathlete. She totally gets who we are and what we need. Great, great conversation, great resource. I also have fabulous shows lined up with Myrna the Myrnavator Valerio and Peloton sensation Christine Diarcol, and many, many more lined up for the new year. So stay tuned. I hope you all have a wonderful, peaceful, happy, healthy holiday season, and we'll see you in 2024. Until then, you know what to do. Stay feisty. You've been listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I'm your host, Celine Yeager. The show is edited and produced by the strong, talented, and amazing women at Live Feisty Media. Follow us on social media at Feisty Menopause, and please help us spread the word. Screenshot and share this episode on your social media channels with the tag @FeistyMenopause. Share the show with your friends, and please subscribe, like, review, and rate this show wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth and good reviews make it easier for other listeners to find. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay feisty.